My brother George and I grew up in the same two-bedroom house in Dayton, Ohio, and for 61 years, there was not a single week where we didn't talk. Not one. He was 3 years older than me. When our father died in 1987, George drove 14 hours straight from Pittsburgh to be there before the funeral home came. When my wife Eleanor passed from ovarian cancer in 2019, he sat on my porch with me for 4 days straight, barely saying a word. Just there, that's who George was. So when his wife called me on a Tuesday morning in March and said he'd had a massive heart attack in his sleep, I didn't believe her at first. George ran 3 miles every other day. He ate oatmeal for breakfast and kept a little notebook where he tracked his blood pressure. He was 68 years old and in better shape than men, 20 years younger. None of it made sense. Her name was Diane. George had married her 11 years ago, about 3 years after his first wife, Linda, passed. I was happy for him then. Diane seemed warm. She laughed easily, remembered birthdays, always brought something to family dinners. I liked her. We all did. I drove to Columbus. That's where George had been living since he retired from his engineering job. And I stayed at the Holiday Inn because Diane said the house was too chaotic with people coming and going. That felt a little strange to me, but I didn't say anything. I was grieving. The funeral was held at a small church on the east side of Columbus. Maybe 40 people. George had been quiet in his retirement years, mostly fishing and woodworking in his garage, so the crowd was intimate. Old work friends, a few neighbors, his son from his first marriage. That son's name was Patrick. He was 34, and he sat in the front pew next to Diane the entire service, stone-faced, not crying, staring straight ahead at the casket. Something about the way he carried himself that day struck me as off. He looked less like a grieving son, and more like a man, waiting for something to be over. After the service, when people were milling around in the church hall, eating finger sandwiches and speaking in the hushed tones people use at funerals, a man in his 60s touched my elbow and asked if we could step outside. His name was Howard Finch. He was George's attorney, had been for nearly 15 years, he told me. He had a calm, measured way of speaking, the kind of man who chose every word deliberately. We walked to the far end of the parking lot, away from the cars, and he looked over his shoulder before he spoke. "Your brother came to see me 6 weeks ago," he said. "He asked me to hold something for you. He was very specific. He said to give it to you at the funeral, privately, and that under no circumstances should Diane or Patrick know about it." He reached into his inside coat pocket and produced a plain, white envelope. My name was written on the front in George's handwriting. That handwriting, I hadn't seen it in a while. We mostly texted, but I would have recognized it anywhere. He also said something else, Howard told me, and his voice dropped lower. He said, "Tell my brother that if anything happens to me before I can explain, he needs to look at everything carefully. Don't let them rush anything." I took the envelope. My hands were not steady. Howard said, "I'm sorry for your loss, sir. George was a good man. Call me if you need anything." Then he walked back toward the church entrance, and I stood there alone in the March wind with my dead brother's handwriting in my hands. I didn't open it in the parking lot. I drove back to the Holiday Inn, sat on the edge of the bed with my coat still on, and opened it. Inside was a folded letter and a small USB drive taped to a piece of cardstock. The cardstock had one line on it in George's handwriting. "Listen to track 4 first." I unfolded the letter. George wrote the way he talked. Direct, no wasted words. He started with an apology for not telling me sooner. He said he hadn't wanted to worry me without being sure, and that for a long time he thought he was being paranoid. But in the last 2 months, he wrote, he wasn't paranoid anymore. He told me he had started feeling ill in the fall. Fatigue, dizziness, heart palpitations. His doctor had run tests and found an elevated level of digoxin in his bloodstream. Digoxin is a heart medication. George was not prescribed digoxin. He had never taken it in his life. His doctor was concerned but didn't immediately suspect foul play. He told George to avoid certain foods that could affect cardiac rhythms, adjusted his other medications, and scheduled a follow-up, but George went home and started thinking. He wrote that Diane had been making his morning coffee and breakfast every day for the past year. Before that, they'd had more separate routines. He'd get up early to go fishing, she'd sleep in. But after he semi-retired from the consulting work he'd been doing, they were home together constantly, and Diane had, in George's words, taken over the kitchen entirely. He hadn't thought anything of it at the time. He wrote that he started watching. He started being careful. He bought a small digital recorder, the kind about the size of a pen, and left it running in the kitchen on days when he made excuses to go upstairs. Over 6 weeks, he recorded 42 hours of audio. He didn't tell me what was on the recordings in the letter. He just said, listen to track 4. Then decide what you think. I didn't have a laptop with me. I drove to a Best Buy 20 minutes away, bought the cheapest laptop they had, drove back to the hotel, and sat there at 9 p.m. plugging in a USB drive while somewhere across town my brother was in a casket. The recordings were labeled track 1 through track 9. I went to track 4. There was ambient noise at first, kitchen sounds, the refrigerator hum, a cabinet opening. Then Diane's voice, then another voice. Male. Younger. Patrick. I sat very still and listened. The conversation lasted about 12 minutes. Patrick asked how much longer it was going to take. Diane told him to be patient, that you couldn't rush these things without raising flags. Patrick said the old man's doctor had already run blood work once, and they needed to be smarter about the amounts. Diane said she knew she'd cut back, she'd been more careful. Patrick said the will situation needed to be handled before anything else. Diane said she'd already spoken to someone about getting him to sign an amendment. He won't question it, Diane said. He trusts me completely. He always has. He's not stupid, Patrick said. He's in love, Diane said. Same thing at his age. There was a pause, and then Patrick laughed. It was not a warm laugh. I had to stop the recording. I sat there for a long time. The air conditioning in the room was running even though it was March, and I remember thinking that was strange. And then I remember thinking that was strange, and then I remember thinking that my mind was reaching for anything ordinary to hold on to. My brother had known. He had known, and he had died anyway, and the woman who had poisoned him was across town right now accepting condolences and eating finger sandwiches. I pressed play again. I listened to all 9 tracks over the next 3 hours. What I learned across those recordings: Diane and Patrick had been in regular contact for at least a year, far more than George knew. Patrick had never liked his stepmother, or so George had believed. In reality, they had formed a quiet alliance centered entirely on George's estate. George's first wife, Linda, had left some assets to Patrick directly. But George himself had done well over the course of his career. A house that had appreciated significantly, a retirement account, stock holdings, and a property in rural Kentucky that his own father had left him. Total estate value, based on what I could piece together from a separate document George had tucked into the envelope, was somewhere between $800,000 and $1.1 million. The plan, from what the recordings made clear, was twofold. First, get Diane named the primary beneficiary in an amended will, or failing that, ensure she had enough joint accounts and survivorship rights to take the bulk of the estate outright. Second, and this is the part that made my stomach turn, use digoxin added to his food over time to mimic a natural cardiac event. Digoxin toxicity, introduced gradually, can look like progressive heart failure in an older man, especially an older man with a note in his chart about elevated levels that his doctor had already seen. They were covering the trail as they built it. George had also included a handwritten note in the envelope listing 3 specific things he wanted me to do. He had thought this through clearly, which tells you everything about who my brother was. Even facing this, he made a plan. He did not fall apart. The first thing he asked me to do was go to his woodshop in the garage. Under the third workbench on the left side, he had taped a manila envelope to the underside. Inside that envelope, he said, was a copy of the original will, a log of dates and symptoms he had kept, and printed transcripts he had made of 3 of the most damning recordings. The second thing he asked was not to confront Diane or Patrick directly. "You'll know less than you think you know," he wrote. and they'll be prepared for anger. Don't give them a target. The third thing he asked was to find out what Patrick had done about the will amendment. He was pushing hard on that, George wrote. If I go before you can stop it, you need to know what they filed. At the bottom of the letter, in smaller handwriting, he'd added a postscript. I'm sorry I waited so long. I kept hoping I was wrong. I wasn't. Take care of yourself, Roy. You're all I've got left. Roy. That's me. I'm Roy. 66 years old, retired postal service, widower, and the only person my brother trusted with the truth before he died. I did not sleep that night. The next morning I drove to George's house. Diane was there with 2 of her sisters and a neighbor I didn't recognize. I said I wanted to spend a few minutes in George's woodshop, that he'd promised to show me a project he'd been working on, and I wanted to see it one last time. Diane smiled that careful smile of hers and said, of course, take all the time you need. The woodshop smelled like sawdust and linseed oil. George had built 3 birdhouses on the workbench, half finished, tools laid out neat beside them. I stood there for a moment just looking at that. He was going to finish those birdhouses. He had plans. I found the manila envelope exactly where he'd said. I tucked it under my jacket and walked back through the house, said my goodbyes, and left. I called Howard Finch from my car. He listened without interrupting as I explained everything. When I finished, he was quiet for a long moment. I need you to bring me everything, he said. The USB drive, the envelope, the letter. Don't share it with anyone else yet. I need to make some calls. What kind of calls? I asked. The kind that protect you and preserve what your brother built, he said. Roy, your brother told me something when he came to see me. He didn't tell me what was in that envelope. He said he couldn't be certain yet, but he said if it went the way he feared, he needed someone who could move fast and smart. That's why he came to me 6 weeks ago. I drove to Howard's office that afternoon. He was already on the phone with someone when I arrived. He held up a finger, finished the call, and spent the next hour reviewing everything I'd brought. He made copies of everything, had me sign a statement documenting the chain of custody of the recordings and documents, and paste a call to the Franklin County Sheriff's Office. Then he told me something I hadn't expected. 2 days before George died, he had called Howard again. He said he was feeling worse. The palpitations were bad. He was exhausted constantly. He asked Howard to help him draft a letter to his doctor requesting a full toxicology review if he died within the next 90 days. Howard had sent the letter. The doctor had received it. That letter was now in the hands of law enforcement. George had done everything right. Even from the edge of whatever was happening to him, he had tried to leave a clear path. What happened over the next 3 weeks moved faster than I could fully track in real time. George's body had not yet been interred. Diane had been making arrangements for cremation, but the timing had not been finalized. That window mattered enormously. The medical examiner's office was given authority to conduct a full autopsy, which had not happened at the time of death because the initial findings had pointed to cardiac arrest with a known risk history. The tox screen came back 10 days later. Elevated digoxin, no prescription, no therapeutic explanation. The recordings were authenticated by a forensic audio specialist Howard retained privately. The transcripts George had prepared matched the audio precisely. A forensic accountant reviewed the estate documents and found that Diane had, in fact, gotten George to sign an amendment to his will 14 months prior, not a complete rewrite, but a change that moved the Kentucky property and the larger portion of the investment accounts into a joint survivorship structure. The attorney who had drafted that amendment had done so without informing George's original estate attorney. That was a problem for multiple reasons that I won't pretend to fully understand, but Howard said it had significant legal consequences. Patrick, it emerged, had his own financial troubles. He'd been through a messy business failure 2 years prior and was carrying significant debt. The motive was not abstract. Detectives interviewed Diane first, then Patrick. I don't know what was said in those rooms, and I wasn't there. What I do know is that on a Thursday evening, 22 days after my brother's funeral, I was sitting in my hotel room. I had extended my stay twice by then, when Howard called and told me they had both been taken into custody. Diane was charged with aggravated murder and 2 counts of attempted murder. Patrick was charged as a co-conspirator in the aggravated murder and 1 count of attempted murder. The amendment scheme had included a plan to gradually compromise the health of a separate individual as well, details of which I'm still not permitted to discuss publicly. I sat on the edge of that hotel bed for a long time after that call. The same bed where I'd sat with my coat still on and opened George's letter. It felt like a long time ago. It felt like yesterday. There's one more thing I need to tell you, and it's the part that I've turned over in my mind more than anything else. George's son from his first marriage, not Patrick, who was Diane's stepson from her own previous relationship, a detail I'd had confused at the outset, was a young man named Calvin. Calvin was 31, quiet, worked as a middle school science teacher in Akron. George had worried about Calvin during all of this. In his letter, he mentioned Calvin twice. He said he wasn't sure if Diane had tried to influence Calvin in any way, and he asked me to check on him. I had called Calvin the night I found the envelope. He was guarded on the phone, not unfriendly, just careful, which seemed to be how he operated in general. I told him I had some things to talk to him about, that they were serious, and that he should not discuss anything about his father's estate or health with Diane or Patrick until we'd spoken. There was a pause on the line, and Calvin said, "I've been eating takeout for 2 months." I didn't understand at first. He explained. About 8 weeks before George died, Calvin had come to Columbus for a long weekend visit. The first evening, Diane had made dinner. He'd eaten a full plate, baked chicken, vegetables, rice. By the next morning, he felt terrible. Heart racing, dizzy, nauseous. He drove himself to urgent care, was told it was likely a stomach virus, and went home to Akron. He never came back to visit. He said he hadn't made the connection until that moment, on the phone with me. He said he'd just thought it was a coincidence. That's what we do, isn't it? We explain things away. We don't want to believe the alternative. Was Diane always that insistent about you eating? I asked. There was another pause. Yeah, he said quietly. She always made a point of it. She'd get almost offended if you didn't finish your plate. Calvin had unknowingly protected himself just by staying away. He hadn't been targeted again, likely because Diane had decided a sick and recovered adult stepchild raised too much risk. But he had been in that kitchen. He had eaten that food. Calvin was the second count of attempted murder. The third, which Howard confirmed once charges were formally filed, was a neighbor of George's named Mr. Aldrich, an 80-year-old retired shop teacher who George had apparently confided in during the final weeks of his life. Mr. Sen. Aldrich had mentioned to Diane that George had seemed worried about something at home. He began feeling ill shortly after that conversation. He survived, but was hospitalized for what was initially described as cardiac irregularity. George had known. He'd known they would cover their tracks. He'd still done everything he could to leave the path lit. I stayed in Columbus for 2 more months, helping Howard and the prosecutors build the record. I drove back to Dayton eventually, to my house that felt too quiet the way houses do when you've been somewhere else for a long time. I sat on my back porch the first night home, and I thought about George. I thought about the phone calls we'd had every week. I thought about the fishing trips we used to take in Kentucky, to the property that his father had left him and that he had always planned to leave to Calvin. I thought about the 4 days he sat on my porch when Eleanor died, barely saying a word. He knew, in those last weeks, what was happening to him. He had to have been afraid. But he still drove to Howard's office. He still set up that recorder. He still taped the envelope under the workbench. He still wrote me that letter in the handwriting I would recognize anywhere. And he made sure it would find me. I'm not a man who cries easily. My generation wasn't raised that way. But I sat on that porch, and I cried for a long time. Calvin is doing well. He comes to Dayton sometimes now, on weekends, and we sit on that same porch. He's a good young man. Quiet, like his father. He drinks his coffee black, and he asks questions about George that I'm glad to answer, because every time I answer one, George is a little bit present in the room again. The Kentucky property is his now, the way George always intended. The will amendment was voided by the probate court. Howard handled that. Diane and Patrick are awaiting trial, and I keep the USB drive in the top drawer of my nightstand. I don't know why. I haven't listened to it again. I don't need to. But I'm not ready to put it somewhere I can't reach it easily. George spent 61 years being my best friend. The least I can do is make sure the last thing he asked of me doesn't get forgotten. I will never ignore a feeling that something is wrong. I will never let the people I love be disappeared quietly while I'm standing close enough to do something. That's what George gave me in the end, not just the truth. The instruction. I'm trying to live up to it. I keep thinking about the birdhouses. George had 3 of them sitting on his workbench, half finished. Tools laid out neat beside them the way he always kept things. He was going to finish those. He had plans for the weekend, probably. Maybe he'd thought about which trees in the yard he'd hang them from, and none of that will ever happen now, because someone who sat across from him at dinner every night decided his life was worth less than a piece of land in Kentucky. That's the thing that doesn't leave me. Not the anger, though the anger is there too, but the sheer smallness of the reason. George was worth more in his little finger than everything Diane and Patrick were chasing combined. He was the kind of man who drove 14 hours straight to be at his brother's side, who kept a notebook tracking his blood pressure, who, even when he knew something was very wrong, sat down and made a plan to protect the people he loved instead of falling apart. And they looked at all of that and saw a dollar amount. What happened to George happened because 2 people made choices. Deliberate, calculating, sustained choices over months. And what happened to them is the direct consequence of those same choices coming back around. Not fate, not luck. Cause and effect, plain and simple. The recordings existed because George was smart enough to make them. The letter reached me because he had the integrity to write it honestly, without self-pity, and the courage to ask for help even when asking felt like admitting he'd been a fool to trust. He wasn't a fool. He was a man who loved carefully and got betrayed by someone who mistook that love for weakness. I think about what it took for him to do what he did in those final weeks. He was sick. He was frightened, even if he never would have used that word. He was watching his own wife with the knowledge of what she was doing, sitting across from her at the breakfast table, carrying that alone, and instead of confronting her in anger, which would have tipped his hand and likely made things worse, he used his head. He stayed quiet. He gathered evidence. He thought 3 steps ahead. That kind of discipline, when everything in you wants to scream, is not easy. It is one of the hardest things a person can do. And then there's Calvin. He protected himself the only way he knew how, by staying away from something that felt wrong even though he couldn't name why. He listened to that instinct. He ate takeout for 2 months because a single dinner in that kitchen had left him feeling like something was very off. He didn't rationalize it away. He just quietly removed himself. That saved his life. I'm not a philosopher. I'm a retired postal worker from Dayton who spent 2 months in a Columbus hotel helping lawyers and detectives follow the trail my brother left. But I've had a lot of time to sit with all of this, and what I keep coming back to is this. The people who survived this story survived because of who they were, not because of luck. George survived in the way that mattered. His truth came out. His estate went to his son. His name is clear because he refused to stop thinking clearly, even when he was being slowly poisoned. Calvin survived because he respected the quiet voice in his gut that said something isn't right here, and I was able to do what George asked because he trusted me and I showed up. None of that is complicated. It's just what it looks like when people do the right thing under pressure. I still have the USB drive in my nightstand. I don't know if I'll ever move it. There's something about keeping it close that feels like keeping a promise. George asked me not to let it go to nothing. I don't intend to. If you love someone, pay attention. If something feels wrong, don't explain it away to spare yourself the discomfort of being right. And if the person you love leaves you instructions, even ones that scare you, follow them. That's not a small thing. That's everything.